Welcome, Gopher Games and Magic fans, and welcome to another episode of The Force of Will. I'm Will, and on these episodes we talk all things Magic the Gathering. This week we're going to continue our dive into the spoilers of the new Zendikar Rising sets, and we're also going to be looking at the new Commander decks. Let's get into it. Let's start things off with Archpriest of Iona. He's a 1-drop, and its power is equal to the number of creatures in your party, and has a toughness of 2. Also, at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. This is just a really good 1-drop for white. Next we have Luminarch Aspirant, a 2-drop human cleric with power and toughness of 1. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Another really solid cleric and a 2-drop slot for any white deck. Next we have Nahiri's Binding. For 1 white, you get an enchantment aura that you can enchant a creature or a planeswalker. An enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. This seems like a pretty solid way of locking down pesky planeswalkers. Nullpriest of Oblivion is 1 and a black for a 2/1 vampire cleric. It also has Kicker 3 and a black. It has Menace and Lifelink, and when Nullpriest of Oblivion enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So 2 mana for a decently statted creature, or 6 mana to bring back something big. Charix, the Raging Isle, is 2 blue for a legendary creature, Leviathan Crab. He's a 0/17. Spells your opponents cast that target Charix, the Raging Island, costs 2 more to cast. Charix also has an activated ability where you pay 3 and it gets +X -X until end of turn, where X is the total number of islands you control. Not only does he make targeted removal worse, but I can definitely see him being a great late game bomb. Shadow's Verdict is 3 black for a sorcery that says exile all creatures and planeswalkers with converted mana cost 3 or less from the battlefield, and all creatures and planeswalker cards with converted mana cost 3 or less from all graveyards. Bye, Uro. Scourge of the Skyclaves is an interesting card. It's 1 and a black for a demon, and its power and toughness are each equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. He also has Kicker for 4 and a black, and if the spell was kicked, each player loses half their life rounded up. Tabarrak's Hope's Demise is 2 and a black for a legendary creature, Demon Cleric. He's 2/2 with flying and has lifelink as long as 5 or more +1/+1 counters are on it. He also has, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on Tabarrak's. If that creature was a cleric, you may draw a card. If you do, lose 1 life. I can definitely see this getting played in an Orzhov Clerics deck. Skyclave Shade is 1 and a black for a 3/1 Shade. He has Kicker for 2 and a black. Skyclave Shade can't block, and if it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. It also has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if Skyclave Shade is in your graveyard and it's your turn, you may cast it from your graveyard this turn. An interesting card, as it will continuously come back even until the late game. Akoum Hellhound will be a great 1-drop for red decks. He's a 0/1 elemental dog with Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. We also have Kargan Intimidator, 1 in a red, human warrior, 3/1, and has one of my favorite lines, "Cowards can't block warriors." He also has an activated ability where you can pay 1 and choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Kargan Intimidator gets +1/+1 until end of turn, or target creature becomes a coward until end of turn, or target warrior gains trample until end of turn. Next we have a cycle of cards that are the special flip cards. Each color has their own creatures that will flip into lands, and sorceries that can flip into lands as well. This one, for example, is Tangled Florahedron. For 1 and a green, you get an elemental 1/1 creature who can tap, and then you can add a forest. Or you can choose instead for it to enter as Tangled Veil, and as it enters, it has to enter the battlefield tap. It's a land and can tap for a green. We also have Ashaya, Soul of the Wild, for 3 green, legendary creature elemental. Ashaya, Soul of the Wild's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. Also, non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. Ashaya, for all of you lore fans out there, is also a fragment of Zyndakar's World Soul, who was summoned by Nissa Ravain to fight against the Eldrazi on our last trip to Zendikar. Akiri is back, this time as the Fearless Voyager. For 1 red-white, you get a 3/3 legendary creature core warrior, who says whenever you attack a player with 1 or more equipped creatures, draw a card. She also has, pay a white, you may unattach an equipment from a creature you control. If you do, tap that creature, and it gains indestructible until end of turn. Ancient Green Warden is 4 green for an elemental 5/7. It has reach, and you can play lands from your graveyard. It also says, if a land enters the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. Double landfall, anyone? Moving on to some more gold cards, we have Brushfire Elemental. For a red and a green, you get a 1/1 elemental creature with haste. Brushfire Elemental can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, Brushfire Elemental gets +2/+2 until end of turn. We have Yasharn, Implacable Earth, 2 green-white for a legendary creature, Elemental Boar, who's a 4/4. And when it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic forest card and a basic plains card. Reveal those cards, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. It also says that players can't pay life or sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activate abilities. We also have Kargan Warleader. For 1 red-white, we have a 3/3 human warrior creature, who says other warriors you control get +1/+1. Moving on to some colorless artifacts, we have Skyclave Relic, where you can pay 3, or pay the kicker for an additional 3, you get an indestructible artifact that can tap, and you can add 1 mana of any color. However, if it was kicked, you get to create 2 tap token copies of Skyclave Relic. Next, we have Lithoform Engine. For 4 mana, you get a legendary artifact. It has 3 different abilities. You can pay 2 and tap it to copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Pay 3 and tap it. You can copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. Or pay 4 and tap it. You get to copy target permanent spell you control, and that copy becomes a token. Next, we have Forsaken Monument, which has the Eldrazi art in it. You can pay 5 for a legendary artifact that says colorless creatures you control get +2/+2, and whenever you tap a permanent for colorless, you add an additional colorless. It also says, when you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. This card is straight up an Eldrazi's best friend. Next, we'll move on to some of the new lands that are in this set. We have Throne of Makindi. You can tap it and add a colorless, pay 1 and tap it and put a charge counter on it, or tap it and remove a charge counter from it and add 2 mana of any 1 color, and you can only spend this mana on kicked spells. We also have Base Camp. It enters the battlefield tapped, it taps for a colorless, or you can tap it and add 1 mana of any color, but you have to spend this mana to cast a cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard spell, or you have to use it to activate an ability of a cleric, rogue, warrior, or wizard. Now we can talk about the pathway lands. They're going to be the dual lands for this set, where you'll get to choose one side or the other. For example, with Clearwater Pathway, you can choose this side and it can tap for a blue, or you can choose Murkwater Pathway and it'll tap for a black. Another example is Cragcrown Pathway that taps for a red, or Timbercrown Pathway that taps for a green. There's a total of 6 of these lands, 3 allied colors and 3 enemy colors. Next, let's move on to the 2 commander decks for this set. The 2 new commander decks are named Land's Wrath and Sneak Attack. And don't worry, both decks contain Sol Ring and Arcane Signet. Let's take a look at the commanders. We have Obun, Moldiah Ancestor. For 1 red, green, white, we get a legendary creature, Elf Spirit, 3/3. Who says at the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is Obun's power. it is still a land. He also has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. A very interesting Lands Matter Commander card, who has a nice flavor throwback to the old Oracle of Moldiah. As for the other deck, we have Anawan, the Ruined Thief. 2 blue-black for a legendary creature, Vampire Rogue, 2/4. He says other rogues you control get +1/+1. And whenever one or more rogues you control deal combat damage to a player, that player mills a card for each 1 damage dealt to them. If the player mills at least 1 creature card this way, you draw a card. Again, another very powerful Rogues Matter card. And for lore-wise, Anawan took part in the battle for Zendikar in the previous sets against the Eldrazi. We have a couple of new cards that are only going to be found in these commander decks. For Land's Wrath, we have 2 new cards, Trove Warden and Geode Rager. Trove Warden is 2 white for a cat beast 3/4 with vigilance. It also has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, exile target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard. And when Trove Warden dies, put each permanent card exiled with it onto the battlefield under the control of that card's owner. Geode Rager is 4 red for an elemental 4/3 with first strike. He also has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, goad each creature target player controls. It also has a couple of cards that are coming in the new Zendikar set, specifically Roiling Regrowth and Murasa Rootgrazer that we talked about previously. And of course, with all commander decks, there's some really strong reprints. For Land's Wrath, we have Admonition Angel, 3 white for a 6/6 flying angel with Landfall that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may exile target non-land permanent other than Admonition Angel. And when it leaves the battlefield, return all cards exiled with it to the battlefield under its owner's control. We also have Sun Titan. For 4 white, we get a 6/6 giant creature with vigilance. That also says, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And another really strong reprint is Omnath, Locus of Rage. 3 red, green, we get a legendary creature elemental 5/5 with Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a 5/5 red and green elemental creature token onto the battlefield. It also says, whenever Omnath Locus of Rage or another elemental you control dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to target creature or player. As for Sneak Attack, the 2 new cards in the deck are Enigma Thief, 5 blue for a Sphinx Rogue 5/5 with flying. It also has Prowl for 3 and a blue. Now, Prowl is an alternate